Okay, so the next speaker is Jeannette Bohg. She's a professor for robotics at Stanford University, where she directs the Interactive Perception and Robot Learning Lab. Before joining Stanford, Jeannette Bohg was a group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems, and before that, she got her PhD at KTH in Stockholm. Her research is at the intersection of robotics, machine learning, and computer vision, and focuses on perception and learning for autonomous robotic manipulation and grasping. So we thank Jeannette Bohg for being here today and look forward to her talk.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this workshop, which is for a different community than I usually talk to. So I hope I can be inspiring how actually we use these large data sets that you're collecting for robot learning. Okay, so with that, let's get started with the talk. My research is basically driven by the question of why humans are so incredible at all these manipulation tasks. And it's really fairly unclear what the underlying principles are of robustness, both in execution and learning these skills. And it is even more unclear how these principles can be transferred to robots that have a completely different embodiment. And so in my lab, we've been working a lot on low-level sensory motor skills. And there has been a lot of progress, not just by our lab, but also by other labs on this. So here are just two examples. The first one shows the Apollo robot grasping the Pringles box with the chips without bumping into obstacles that are being moved around here by Jim Mainprice, who you see in this robot is really quite reactive and can perceive really quickly and then decide what to do. And the second example shows another robot that uses vision and touch perception to just do like a contact-rich manipulation task while being perturbed by my student, Michelle Lee here. So these are kind of two examples for low-level sensory motor skills that are always used to be quite hard. But what I'm recently very interested in is actually to go beyond sensory motor skills and enable robots to do tasks that require reasoning over a much longer horizon. And so example tasks in this kitchen here, for instance, are emptying the dishwasher and putting the plates and everything away into the right places, preparing different meals, or stowing groceries. And so for a robot, these kinds of tasks require both symbolic and continuous plans. And here's an example for the Tower of Hanoi game, where we show like two symbolic solutions with the associated continuous actions that the robot actually needs to do. And so the symbolic task plan here consists of symbolic actions like pick and place, transport, and so on, that then each have to be realized by this robot motion. And the challenge is to find a valid symbolic plan, or the challenge is that a symbolic plan may not necessarily be kinematically possible, and therefore has to be checked by planning the robot motions for the entire task plan. And this can be really quite an expensive search to do. And the field of task and motion planning in robotics addresses this challenge. And so I just want to show you how a robotics architecture for a long horizon task might look like that specifically uses this task and motion planning paradigm. So at first you have a task planner that plans kind of these symbolic actions. And then it basically runs this through a motion planner to figure out whether this is actually kinematically feasible for the robot. And so this informs the task planner again to potentially continue searching. And this is what is called task and motion planning, called TAMP here. And so once you have a motion plan, you send it to some reactive controller that executed it in the actual environment. And that environment responds in some way, and the reactive controller has to react to it and maybe has to change the motion plan or even change the task plan online to react to anything that's unexpectedly happening. And so obviously there is a lot of perception here going on as well. So the environment has to be visually perceived, and this information has to be somehow be fed to the task planner as feedback, to the motion planner as feedback, or to the reactive controller. And so I will use this graph throughout the talk to explain a little bit of how we are realizing each of these boxes and each of these arrows as well. And just for simplicity, I will take out all of this perception part here. To make this plot a little bit easier, but I'm going to come back to this. So generally, the way we implement these architectures is going to be based on 3 principles. First of all, people are using abstractions to basically get rid of details that are not important for planning on a particular level. And so I will show how we implement these abstractions. We will also use learning from demonstrations, specifically from these large-scale activity data sets that you guys are all collecting, and enable robots to do these low-level primitive tasks. And then one really important thing is that no matter how good we implement anything on a robot, for sure something is going to go wrong. And so what we also want to implement is a way to always keep replanning. And therefore, we also need always a way to monitor what's going on actually in the world. Okay, so these are the 3 principles. And so I want to start this talk by introducing task and motion planning a little bit more formally. And specifically, I want to focus on how in our work we specifically enabled adaptation, so this continuous replanning thing that I just talked about, to deal with any kind of environment changes that are happening all the time. So this work is based on principles of symbolic abstractions, of using those in this task plan, but also on just the continuous replanning. So here's a robot that wants to put the small box onto the large box. And the problem is the small box is outside of the workspace of the robot. So it needs to basically get this hook there to get the little box smaller so that it can actually reach it and put it on that large box. And in order to do that, it needs to basically plan on a symbolic level, and it also needs to include some geometric reasoning to figure all of this out. And then what we specifically are interested in is like, oh, how can this plan that is actually quite expensive to compute, how can we adapt this to any changes, avoiding the need to do expensive replanning? How can we keep basically a computer plan that keeps being valid despite all of these different changes that are happening online? Okay, so that's the goal of this work. And so for planning this kind of continuous motion that you've just seen, we basically use something called trajectory optimization. It's very similar to RL, just that we assume we know what the robot is doing and how the world is changing, which is quite a reasonable assumption. And so just to explain a little bit of variables, where the X here basically refers to the motion of the n effector. And we basically want to basically optimize that trajectory. The way we do that is by basically sending joint torques called here UT, a sequence of this to the robot arm. And we are trying to find the optimal sequence of these control commands by minimizing this cost function here, which consists of the terminal cost. So that's based on the state that we want to achieve at the very end, and at the running cost of each action that we take. Okay. And so, so that's what we are basically using. And now to plug this into this task planner, where we also want to optimize over discrete primitive actions, we're adding these actions A here to our as an optimization variable. And so these are these discrete actions like pick and place. And then what we do is we add a bunch of constraints to this problem. The cost function basically stays the same. And this is very similar to this work that you see at the bottom by Marc Toussaint, and when he was at Josh Tenenbaum's lab, and has this collaboration with this lab. Okay, so we basically add a bunch of constraints like the start, about the start and the final state. We add continuous systems dynamic, which changes dependent on a discrete state S, and also the instantaneous system dynamics when we actually switch between different discrete actions. And we also assume that this whole optimization problem fulfills some logic planning framework, okay? And so where does logic plan that plans on the level of discrete actions come from, we basically use classic strips planning. And this is the PDDL description, so the kind of the domain description of this particular problem that I just showed you, of picking the small box and putting it on a big box. And so using that, we can basically use the strips planning to get a planning tree and find a good symbolic plan. So what we have now, given this action skeleton of the symbolic plan, we want to derive this continuous motion of the robot that realizes the symbolic plan. And our specific contribution is to formulate this problem as optimizing over a sequence of relative Cartesian frames. So this is an object-centric representation that has several advantages. And I want to explain this with this example. So let's say this robot wants to pick up this little green box here and place it on this blue shelf. So what you first do is you control the joints of the arm such that the end effector of the robot is in a specific pose relative to this target box and to this green box. And now there are many ways in reality on how this green box is going to end up being grasped by the hand. So that is what you see here on the right. So there might be small pose changes relative to the end effector, and that will influence how you need to control the joints of the arm for placing the green box onto this blue box. But if you optimize the joint trajectory in that optimization problem that I just showed you, which is what is most commonly done, this trajectory would need to be replanned now. And this is very annoying. And by using actually an object-centric representation, so these relative Cartesian frames, we can just actually control this green box in whatever way it is in the hand, doesn't matter, relative to the blue shelf to achieve the desired relative frame transform of actually placing it on that blue box. So this is basically assuming that we can perceive all these things, where basically the green box and the blue box is. There's a chat message. Oh, okay, yeah, please, by the way, please feel free to interrupt me or ask any question in between. I'm happy to answer them. Okay, so that is the main idea. And so now the resulting system looks like this, right? We have a task planner that comes up with an action skeleton that looks good for some kind of problem solving. It checks with the motion planner like, oh, does that even work for the robot, or is that infeasible for the robot? And if not, it keeps going and searching until it finds a valid plan. And so this is typically done in TAMP, and we specifically do this in a way that uses an object-centric representation, and as I just explained, and we send it to the reactive controller that executes it in environment and can actually take feedback into account. So what we haven't yet done is closing this loop again, but we can talk about that in a bit. So I saw there was another chat. Yeah, I guess for both of us. Okay, so so again, like I already showed you this video, this is basically the output of our system, where for this particular Tower of Hanoi problem, you actually get multiple solutions from this task and motion planner. And here you see how both of these solutions are basically being executed with the robot. And specific or special to our method is, as I also already showed you, that it can actually just keep using the same plan without going through expensive replanning, despite all these changes. And then we also executed this particular plan on a real robot. So here we use basically model-based vision of just using a tracker that we actually augmented with these AR markers. And you can see that despite all of these things being changed or moved around by my student Toki here, the robot is still able to execute these things, even though maybe the box even changes. All right, so so just to summarize this particular part of the work, it's called object-centric task and motion planning, specifically in dynamic environment. And the main idea is that to use symbolic planning to create an action skeleton that translates into a constrained motion optimization problem. And our specific algorithmic contribution here was to reformulate this problem to optimize over relative Cartesian frames, which makes it basically able to do task and motion planning in dynamic environments online. Dima. any question?
Can I ask a question? Yes. I'm curious whether this idea of replanning is similar to how humans do it. I'm just imagining someone trying to do the task and you're moving something in front of them. I don't think they will adapt that easily. I don't know whether whether there is any research or whether or you're planning there is any similarity, because in our data set, for example, people make mistakes, and observing these videos, people react very differently. Different people, of course, react differently. But it's not easy to figure out how people replan, if that makes sense. So what do you base solutions on?
Right. So that's a great question. So first of all, I'm super interested in how robots can notice that they make mistakes and then recover from them. And I don't think there's like the one solution for it. And yes, and also there are many different possibilities. First of all, I want to say I'm not a cognitive scientist. I have no idea what people are actually doing, right? Like how they're really doing it. I can just tell you that in this particular work, what we have done is really to just assume that we can track these objects, and so we know their frames. And if you know, like, oh, I want my hand, I want my hand definitely wrapping itself around this particular box. And so as long as you can track this box, you can basically follow it around until you finally got it, right? But that only works, or let me say, this only works to some extent of the box actually moving around, right? So if there's a lot of changes, you may want to completely change the task plan on the higher level, right? And so I'm going to talk at the very end about how we do that. Whether this is what people do, I don't know, but it's a very interesting question to see in your data sets, for example. Is there a way to discover strategy for recovering actually in a particular way? I think that would be very interesting. We can talk maybe about this later. This is definitely not something we have solved, but I will show some solutions where we basically do trigger replanning for sure. Whether this is close to what humans do, I have no idea. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so now I told you now about task and motion planning, basically, and there's no learning in there, like nothing. This is like classic robotics, and we made it work nicely in dynamic environments, assuming we have some vision system that gives us these objects in some way. Okay, and so what actually is very annoying about this, and this must be clear to anyone who works with learning, right, is like, or with robotics, is to actually define these actions. And, maybe this PDDL description actually is not so bad. I'm going to talk about that later. This we can kind of do. But how to define or translate these actions into these constraints, these functions, fPath and fSwitch here, this is very tedious and annoying. So my student, Toki, who has done this work, he can sing a song of this. And so we really want to scale it up to all of these different actions that we, for example, have in your large scale data sets. And this was really the questions we were kind of asking next, like, this is too annoying. Like, how do we get this to scale up? And so what we looked at next, how to basically look at this middle part of this motion planner, the reactive controller. How can we maybe scale this up and learn this actually from these data sets, of these large activity data sets? And in terms of the principles that I talked about before that we're using in all this works, here we're really looking at, again, how can we find abstractions for these actions that can then maybe be used by a task planner? And how can we scale this up by maybe learning from demonstrations, specifically from these video demonstrations? Okay, so let's talk about this work that is called Concept to Robot. And here we're talking about action concepts to robots that was published at ISS in 2020. So basically, our idea or our goal was we wanted to endow our robot with the ability to acquire manipulation concepts. And the way we see these concepts is as mental representations of verbs in a sentence. And so given an initial scene image, like here on the left, when we send various instructions, such as put something behind something, You see which data set we're going to use, or put something into something. We want our robot to generate motion trajectories to accomplish these tasks. And to achieve this goal, we basically went down the route of constructing an embedding space that associates task instructions and scene images with motion trajectories of the robot. And constructing an embedding space of manipulation concepts offers several benefits. First, we can specify the manipulation task with language instructions instead of goal images. And describing the task with language is much simpler than providing a goal image. And second, we can obtain a multitask policy to represent diverse manipulation skills, such as open something or close something. And third, by training on a diverse set of manipulation tasks, our policy can actually generalize to novel but similar instructions in the form of natural language. And so how do we train the robot to output trajectories to accomplish this task? So our approach uses learning from visual demonstrations, and it allows us to avoid things like annoying reward engineering or kinesthetic teaching or teleoperation, which are very time consuming and difficult to scale up to a large number of tasks. And as you already guessed, we used the 20 billion something data set as the source for our visual demonstrations for this particular work. And it contains around 200K video clips with 174 different action classes. And each video clip is annotated with task descriptions, such as putting something on a surface or moving something up. And so the problem, though, is there's a huge domain gaps between the human demonstrations and robot simulation, right? As you see here. So take close something as an example. On the left, you see like these 4 examples of closing something, but they're all quite different from robot simulation, from the way this is rendered. And we need a learning from visual demonstration method that can handle different backgrounds, different viewpoints, different objects, and so on. And so the main idea that we followed here is that we address this large domain gap by using a video action or video activity classifier to evaluate the robot trajectories. So the video action classifier is firstly trained to classify the action labels of each video clip in the 20 billion something data set. But then we use this classifier to score robot videos. So the score then represents how confident the video classifier estimates the robot video to belong to the corresponding action label, or to, so how confident is this this video classifier that the robot has executed that particular action. Okay, okay, so this learning from demonstration pipeline that we implemented works as follows. So first we send a language instruction and initial scene image as the input to our model by concatenating their features to provide semantic context. And you see here the models that we use. Then a policy generation network outputs a motion trajectory specified as a goalpost. Sorry. So it's specified as a goalpost and also a series of forces to perturb the otherwise straight line trajectory. So it's kind of shaping it. And then next we execute this motion trajectory, open loop in simulation, and render it to get a video. And this video is sent to the action classifier to get a score, which is used as a reward. So we run a reinforcement learning algorithm to update the parameters of the motion trajectory to maximize the reward that comes in the form of this activity classifier score. And so while the 20 billion something data set contains 174 different action classes, we selected 78, which are suitable for our robot simulation. And we set up, so for example, there's things like ripping paper and stuff like this. And like simulation is actually not very good, as you probably know if you ever work with it. So we couldn't take these on. But 78 different tasks are still much more than any other kind of simulation environment actually in robotics can do. So this is already pretty good. So we set up these simulation environments in PyBullet And for each task, we train a policy using this learning from demonstration pipeline that I just showed you. So here we show some examples of the 78 different tasks. This is the task of closing something. And note that we test our policy with randomly generated initial object poses. So here of this draw, here's tilt something with something on it so that it falls. You know, if you look at our webpage, you can see all of these different examples as well. And so up to now, we have trained 78 different single task experts, each of which outputs motion trajectories to accomplish one specific task. But remember, our ultimate goal was to construct a unified model to represent a diverse set of manipulation skills. And we formulate this as a multitask learning problem. And so we train this multitask policy by running behavior cloning on the previously learned single task expert trajectory. So the reason for that is that now, but the single task expert have actually trajectories in form of joint angles in them, which the videos that we trained these on didn't, right? So now we can do this behavior cloning, which needs this. So the result is a unified model that can take in various task instructions and scene images as input and output trajectories for 78 different tasks. Sorry, I'm losing my voice today. Okay, so here we show some examples of the multitask policy on the diverse set of tasks. Here are some more. And what is also
please let us know if you need a break, even a short one. To grab some water.
Thank you.
Okay, but just let us know.
I got it, but yeah.
Okay.
Once I'm in the state, it takes like a few minutes to recover, but I think it's okay. Thank you. So this is an example where we use slightly different formulations of the instructions. And you can still see when we feed these in, the output policies that the robot actually executes, they are very similar, or they are actually doing the right thing. So this is more like a qualitative thing we've done. We haven't done this systematically, but we are very excited about this as well. So yeah, so just to summarize this work, so this is called Conceptual Robot. If you want to read on all the details on this, learning manipulation concepts from instructions and human demonstrations. And the main idea is to learn this embedding space for manipulation concepts indexed by natural language instructions. And as an algorithmic contribution, we propose this whole framework of imitation learning from human video demonstration using this activity classifier to provide reward. So the result was that we got a multitask policy that can execute 78 different tasks indexed by natural language instructions. Okay, so now we have a system that takes as input natural language and produces the corresponding motion primitive. And this is, in this entire system, this is where this fits in. But of course, we have now these primitives. We still want to sequence these primitives together to achieve a higher level goal, like some long horizon task that maybe requires multiple of these. And so remember, in our TAM framework, we use the strips logical planning to search for a symbolic action plan based on pre and post condition of these discrete action primitives. And this kind of symbolic planning is actually well understood and works if we have a description like this one for our planning domain. And I will come back later to this point on whether this is easy or not to derive such a planning domain. So we basically want to keep this logic symbolic planner, so this task planner here on top, to trigger the correct manipulation concept that we learned with this conceptual robot work. But now the tricky question becomes, how do we perceive the symbolic state of the environment for the many possible propositions that are now required for planning over this large variety of actions. And besides grounding these abstract symbols, we also want to enable continuous replanning, specifically continuous task replanning. So in this last part of the talk, I will talk about our work on grounding symbols through actions in large-scale activity data sets. And this is really hot off the press. We literally submitted this 2 days ago. So also, I'm presenting this for the first time. So recent examples of actually, so these are some recent examples of works that use symbolic planning for enabling a robot to do these long horizon tasks. And all of these works require some way to perceive symbols in the environment. Also our own work does that, right? And perceiving symbols in real world environments is currently an unsolved problem. Without a way to perceive symbols in the real world, all of these works are currently limited to simulated environments where symbolic states can easily be obtained, or in simple known environments where visual heuristics for symbolic states can be kind of coded up by hand. So in the computer vision community, I think you call this problem of perceiving the symbolic state visual relationship detection or scene graph generation, basically. So you have all these interesting data sets here as well. But annotating symbols is actually very expensive. So this is an example from Visual Genome. And here you see for this one frame, all the symbols that are actually annotated. But then here are all the symbols that are actually not annotated, right? So because it's so expensive to annotate these symbols, you still cannot do the full state, right? Like, so all of these things are actually missing. So what our core idea for this approach was to actually exploit that we know how actions are changing the symbolic state and use that to annotate frames with partial symbolic state that is relevant to that action. So let me give you an example. So here we have an action, put something into something, and specifically it's about putting an egg into a bowl. And we know basically from a description of this action that before the action is successfully executed, the preconditions for these actions are that the egg is in the hand and the egg is not yet in the bowl. And we also know that after the action has been executed, the symbols change to basically the egg is now in the bowl and it's not in the hand anymore. There are also states here that we cannot really annotate with actions, like, oh, the egg fits into the bowl and is reachable by the bowl, right? So with this, if we know the symbolic description of these actions and how they change from pre to post conditions, these actions actually give us partial state labels without us needing to go and manually or pay someone to do it for us. So what do we need to do that? We need to define a symbolic domain. I'm going to come back to this later. And we need to acquire a data set of actions. And thankfully, your community has already done that for us, which is great. And then once we have that, we can learn the visual groundings of how does a symbol that we need for a robot actually look like in a video. All right, so let me give you an overview of this method that we're thinking about. Let me first talk about this planning domain description language and how that looked like. So it's called PDDL, right? So predicates are basically things like that that describe a particular object, like in, closed, locked, and so on. So in itself is a predicate, and it has here in this case 2 parameters. And when you instantiate them, this becomes a proposition. And so a state is really a set of these propositions that are instantiated with particular objects in the scene. And so this is what we want per frame to label basically a data set with this state so that we can then train state classifiers that are useful to a robot. So in the PDDL domain, these are the kind of actions like pick, place, open, and so on. And actions have preconditions that look like something like this, for example. And I don't want to go too much in detail this, but they also have post conditions, right, that we can define. And we, in our specific case, to make this all feasible, we flatten these preconditions and post conditions into disjunctive normal form. Doesn't matter right now what this means. It's just easier to deal with. So once we have this form, we can actually train a predicate network as well. So this is how this predicate network basically looks on a high level. It takes an RGB frame as input, and it also assumes there is some object detector that gives us basically bounding boxes around all the objects in the scene. So here a cup and a hand. And then we basically process the frame like this. And finally, we the CNN here on the right takes all of these different inputs. Okay, so this predicate network now can basically classify different propositions. So like this one, for example, these are all the propositions that are just in relation to the cup that has been detected and just have one argument as input. Here it's the same proposition or prepositions, but now with the hand as input. And here we have the prepositions that are actually taking two arguments as input. And this is basically what the numbers or the probabilities that these propositions are true are output by this predicate network. So how do we train this now, this predicate network, with our labels that we obtained from this trick of using the actions to get these partial labels for us? So at train time, we sent before and after image of an action being performed to the network, along with the bounding boxes of the object. And the network then outputs predictions for the before and after states. And we compare these predictions to the partial state labels obtained from the pre and post condition DMFs that we defined before. And again, these are partial labels that we got from the actions. So we cannot basically evaluate all of the predictions that the network makes. And we take the ones that we have information for, compare these, and then update the predicate network based on this. Okay, so we tested this whole idea as a proof of concept on the 20 billion something data set, because we worked with this before. It's a large scale data set, as you know. I already explained that, what it's like. And it's actually quite a difficult data set. I think Lorenzo Torresani also mentioned that it's actually difficult for their method. For us, it was difficult because it has this huge variety of environments. And our hope was that by training this predicate classifiers on this data set, we can obtain something that is useful for identifying symbolic states in real world environments. And and again, like this data set is not annotated with these symbolic states, right? With these predicates that are useful for us doing task planning on a robot. Okay, so just coming back to one point about like doing this, what we're doing with this trick of the actions, how much better is it actually than doing these manual annotations, right? So for this particular data set, we have 171 actions. We actually removed 2 of them that had like some numbers on them, which were difficult to model. So we have 171 actions and 151 propositions and 130K videos that correspond to them. So if we would pay a person that basically ground truth annotates the states, and we assume that this person needs 2 minutes for the first frame and maybe 10 minutes per video, then if this person worked 24 hours a day, this would be basically 22K working hours, which corresponds to 7.5 years. And so if you take a grad student like Toki here, who knows a little bit about PDDL, it would probably take this expert 10 minutes per action to to basically define this PDDL domain and the pre and post conditions. And this corresponds to probably 30 working hours, right? And at an 8-hour workday, maybe these are 4 days of work, right? Oh, by the way, the 7.5 years here, these are with 8-hour workdays. If you have a person that actually works 24 hours a day, it's like 2 years. So this is like quite a stark difference on the time you actually save on using this insight that we had on using the action description itself, and it doesn't take so long to actually define it. Okay, so here are some results on the 20 billion something data set. So these are the before and after image, and that we are now trained. And here are the F1 scores on these predicate classifiers that we achieve at train and at test time. And so here's some examples of how this looks like on these videos. So again, like the predicate network outputs a prediction for every proposition for every frame, but because there are so many, 151 propositions in total, it's a bit overwhelming to watch all of them in a video. So instead, we only show the propositions that are relevant to the particular action being performed, which is here approaching something with your camera. And so we also show here when the pre and post conditions of the actions are satisfied on the top. And at test time, the network actually has no knowledge about what action is being performed or what pre and post conditions are associated with it. The only input to the network is the image and the bounding boxes, and the output is the predictions for all the propositions. And all of these examples I'm going to show come from the test set. And so here it starts off with a pretty confident prediction that the doorknob is not closed. And somewhere in the middle of the video, it gets a little fuzzy. And by the end, it recognizes that the doorknob is closed. So here we have, in this video, we see that the book starts off as not closed and open and ends closed and not open. So you also see the hand go off screen at the end, so it becomes not visible as well. And so here we have the action of bending something until it breaks, specifically on this toothpick. And you notice that the post conditions never get satisfied. And that's because the way we defined this action was the object would be deformed or bent during the action. But after the action, the object would be broken and not deformed. That's just how we defined it. And the network seems to interpret deformed in a different way, where the object is still considered deformed after it's broken. And perhaps this means we should change the post condition of the bend break action to match this particular interpretation. So one limitation of using this the pre and post.
Yeah, we have just a few minutes because we should move to the next session. We are a bit behind the schedule also because of the last talk.
Yes,
yeah,
I'm almost done.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
These are just like a bunch of examples. So I think I need maybe 2 minutes, if that's okay.
I think so. Yes.
Okay. So here's one limitation of using the pre and post conditions that is that you can't specify propositions that are true while actually performing the action. So before and after poking the flashlight and the hand aren't touching, and this is stated in the pre and post conditions, but there's no way to say that the flashlight and hand are touching during the poking action, at least with this PDDL way that we use. But then when you watch the video, you see that the network actually does pick this up. And this is because it learns the attaching predicate from other actions in the 20 billion something data set that are now basically moved here. Okay, so now how do we plug this into our entire system is the question. So now we have these symbolic state classifiers that help us to perceive the initial state of the environment, but also allow us to continuously monitor the system state and trigger task replanning. Okay, so this is now the interesting thing that we want to do. So here we have an example of closed loop planning on a real robot. So on the top, you see just all the basically conditions that are being perceived. And here I just want to show an example that we haven't even yet submitted of the robot doing this task of putting the banana into the drawer. And you see that Toki is gonna close the drawer again. Using these predicate classifier, the robot actually recognizes them and opens the drawer again. So it allows us to actually do this closed loop task planning, the adaptation that Dima was talking about. Okay, so just a summary. This work was just submitted. I think I won't go through it. We have used the something data set, and we would love to look at more complex data set, maybe even the Ego 4D data set. Let's see about that. And I showed you how we basically constructed this entire robotic system for long horizon tasks with these 3 example projects that I talked about. And we implemented basically these 3 principles that are really important for robots. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank all the sponsors and of course, my great students. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. So before moving to, before the questions, I'd like to ask the next panelists to raise their hands so that we can promote them to panelists. And
Should I
also
stop sharing maybe?
Oh yeah, I think that's fine. Okay. And also questions to Lorenzo should be sent to Lorenzo directly because he cannot be here to answer. So apart from that, is there any question from the audience for Jeannette?
Thank you, Jeannette. Great talk. I want to ask about anticipation. And since in Ego 4D, we have this task of anticipation. How you see anticipation? Where do you see anticipation in robotics, especially when there is interaction with the humans? Can you imagine where this task can be useful, and if it's useful in your field, and why?
So when you say, just let me clarify what anticipation means. Is this basically predicting what is going to happen next?
Exactly. Before it happens.
Yeah. So, I mean, for sure, this is like super important for a robot to be able to know, like, what are the particular things that may go wrong or may go differently when the robot does something. So this is useful for planning and just planning differently to maybe avoid something, or to, if it's unavoidable, it's a prediction that's going to be unavoidable because the robot doesn't have control over it, then maybe the robot can at least try to plan something more safely, or maybe wait to do something, right? So it's very, basically, if the robot can predict what's going on, it's just very useful for it to inform planning, even task planning or motion planning, for sure. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? People who are panelists can just open their mic and talk if they wish. Other questions?
I have another question if there's time.
Sure.
It's interesting. The something dataset was labeled in a very different way than other datasets. So this idea of push left to right, push right to left, you wouldn't find another dataset labeled like this, because we just say push, right? And everything, all types of pushes are in the same boat. Was this part of your decision in using it? Is that it is at that level, or it doesn't matter at that level?
So, yeah, this is a very, so I'm going to give you the very honest answer of like, we found this data set and it has this very close-up view of hands and objects and interaction. And so it, plus these actions, and I don't think that we specifically looked at from left to right or right to left or these things. So I think we were only interested in the verbs and how they qualify with respect to the object. So this left to right was actually not super important, I think.
Okay.
But I think, honestly, we found this data set. It was used in other robotics work. And so we had this idea of using this activity classifier. But really, this is not a very deep reason, I have to say. But now that we look at the other data sets that are out there and that you are using, the interesting part here was, first of all, it was really focused on hands, right? And was this egocentric one. So these other data sets that are maybe not so focused on this object-hand interactions were not as interesting to us.
Yeah.
And then for the egocentric data sets that are much longer, they're more complex because they have all these gaze shifts, right? So suddenly we have to deal with all of this. So this is going to be very interesting to deal with this. So, but you know, this makes it also much, much harder. That I think is a stronger reason for using the something.
Very much for the talk. Very clear.
Yeah.